All right, let's dive into this. I'm going to spend the first half of this discussion, so you'll have to listen to me for the next, I don't know, 45 minutes or so. And then I'm going to hand it over to Emil. And throughout this, again, Emil, he'll be commenting, all of you, as you need to, as you want to. Don't hesitate. Let's just chime in and make it happen, okay?
Let's do it.
One of the things, I'm going to go right to the objectives for today. And we should be able, by the time we're all done, we should be able to talk about the consequences of a failed probation or parole effort. We should be able to talk about the impact of stigma and bias on both treatment and recovery. We should be able to talk about, there are definitely 6 barriers to successful reintegration. There's probably 600. But all we need to do is be able to identify 6. We should be able to cite some examples of peer support interventions that will overcome some of those barriers to reentry. I've got a slide with more than enough that we'll be able to kind of choose from. I want folks to understand and be able to interpret the subcultures of addiction and incarceration and the impact that those subcultures have on the individual. Because I will just give you a sneak peek. They are a major barrier to recovery. We don't talk about it very much, even though we focus really heavily on cultural competence, cultural proficiency, cultural humility. How did we miss this? I'm not sure. And there's also a culture of corrections, right? You could probably attach culture to many things. But we're going to talk about addiction, incarceration, and homelessness, because those 3 are the biggies. I've been a part of all 3 of them. I suspect some of the folks on this call have too. And I'll bet that many of the folks on this call have participated in at least one of these at some point in their life. And then we should be able to talk about drug courts and why they're effective, and why they're a better alternative than a traditional court for folks who have a substance use or a mental health challenge, or both. All right. We want to get a scope or a sense of what is happening in terms of full justice system, right? And it's huge. I mean, I don't think I have to tell you, we've got 1 million people in state prison, right? We've got 600,000 that get released yearly from state and federal prisons. There's more than 10 million people cycling through local jails. 2/3 of those people get rearrested within 3 years. We're going to talk about why that sometimes happens, okay? Why that happens actually often. And half of those people get reincarcerated, often on technical violations. So no real crime was committed, but somebody, missed an appointment with probation, or, blew off a job referral that, their parole agent gave them. It's easy to get violated on technicalities. And we think about the collective number of folks who were under some sort of criminal justice involvement. There are almost 7 million people on probation, in jail, in prison, or on parole in this country. And every year, more than 600,000 of those folks come home. So the truth is, not all of us are going to be gone forever. In fact, the vast majority of us are going to come home. And if we're not ready to do that, and if the community isn't ready to have us return, you see already what's happening. And we've been watching this happen now for years, decades, actually. And today, because of the danger of opioid overdose, particularly for people re-entering, it becomes more important than ever that we understand what's in our jails and prisons, that a lot of those folks are going to come home. And if we're going to change anything, then we're going to need to do upstream work, and we're going to need to meet people at the gate. We're also going to need to start reentry planning at arrest, because if we miss any of those, I've got a colleague, Daryl McGraw, the name may be familiar to some of you. And he talks about this all the time. Listen, if we don't start at arrest, by the time we wasted a huge amount of time prepping somebody around the value of recovery. When you have them, a sort of captive audience, if you will, right? There's a lot of folks who are hungry for recovery, but don't have any idea how to get there. And they also have a lot of influence through those subcultures I mentioned that keep them from getting there. Okay. When we talk about community corrections, really the difference is, community corrections is when you are being supervised in the community. You may be on probation, you may be on parole. You don't necessarily have to go to jail or prison to be part of the community corrections. I think, a couple times I was sentenced to probation and, some constraints on what I was able to do, but didn't have to do any jail time. Other times it wasn't so fortunate. But what we want to understand about community corrections is it's also massive. And I don't have 2023 data. I've got some fairly recent stuff. This one for me, 2020, it's okay. It doesn't capture COVID as much, or at all, actually. But it's still pretty accurate. And we're talking about almost 4 million people under community supervision. Now, the cool thing is, it's down about 270,000 from January 1st, 2020. So we've been able to discharge almost 300,000 people off of probation or parole in a year. And of course, this is national. So, it's still 300,000 is a fairly big number. And, we can applaud that. About 1 in 66 adults in this country were under community supervision at the end of 2020. The adult probation population actually declined 8.3% in 2020. Sorry for this data and all these stats, but they matter because what we're seeing are declinations. These numbers are declining. And that number, 8.3% through 2020, the largest annual decrease since 1980, when the Bureau of Justice Statistics actually began collecting information. So oddly enough, as much as we hear about the increases in crime, especially today, it's not really accurate. And not only that, our prison and jail and parole and probation numbers are dropping. So if there were, this massive amount of crime in the inner cities, we'd be seeing it in the numbers, and the numbers aren't lying, right? So I'm going to trust these numbers before I trust any talking head that shows up on TV. I don't know what their agenda is. I have no idea. I know what ours is, and that is to try to support people coming out of those institutions so they don't ever have to go back. And if I can do that, if we can do that, we've done our job. And I can't ask for anything more than that. We also saw probation populations decrease in 42 states and DC, and in the federal system. But there was an increase in 7 different states. And I think I'm going to talk about that a little later on. And I'll just give you a quick example. Pennsylvania has, on paper, it looks like they really have been dropping the jail population, the prison population. They've done a great job. But when you look at the full criminal justice picture for them, they're one of the most punitive states in the nation. So you would get the data, and the data would look like, wow, their stuff is really going well in Pennsylvania. Yeah, because they may not be sending you to jail or prison, but they definitely have you caged with probation and parole. Let me see, is there anything else I really want to talk about in here? Here's one that I think is probably important. From 2005 to 2020, the community supervision rate decreased 32% from, I don't know, to 2,200 and some to 1,511, and that's per 100,000 adults. So that 32% over the last 15 years, I mean, I think that's pretty significant. When we think about disparities in community corrections, they look identical to what they are in jail and prison. And this racial gap, Black adults 3.5 times as likely as whites to be supervised. And though Blacks make up 13% of our population, 30% are on probation or parole. That's very close to what we see in the penitentiary too. Men are supervised at a rate of about 3.5 times of women. That's changing a little bit. We haven't seen the numbers yet, but man, they have really gone after women. It feels like there was a shift somewhere where they stopped cutting slack to women if they were ever doing that. The number of women under supervision has nearly doubled from 520,000 in 1990 to more than 1 million at the end of 2016. That's what I mean. They just took the gloves off, and went after the ladies as much as they went after the guys. Let's see. Women accounted for 1/4 of the probation population and 1 in 8 parolees by 2016. At the end of 2016, 8 in 10 probationers, 2/3 of parolees sentenced for nonviolent crime. Drug and property crimes each accounted for more than 1 million of those folks on parole or probation. And if you get a sense of scale here, that little, flashing colored paragraph or sentence down there, if individuals under supervision for drug or property crimes made up a city, that city would rank among the 10th largest cities in this country. That is a lot of people. All right. So we know that this is a problem. And we also know that, incarceration, whether you're a corrections officer or you're an inmate headed there, there's a lot of trauma. And there is a lot of secondary trauma. First, folks come in with trauma just, kind of oozing out of their pores. I was certainly one of those folks. And we don't really understand what trauma is doing to us at that point in our lives. And then we have corrections officers who also may be showing up with their own trauma. We don't know. But what we can guarantee is that you're going to be exposed to secondary trauma while you're inside that facility. And the thing about secondary trauma, and we're going to talk more about this, is that as it accumulates, it don't go away, right? So corrections officers are often working in a trauma response, in a traumatic environment with people who have the potential to cause great harm. Not that inmates do that, but there is the potential there. That's a really important piece around trauma, because to be traumatic, and I'll hit the next slide. This, I think, will explain a little bit more. But in order for it to reach the level of the kind of trauma we're talking about, you have to have a condition or situation occurring around you that is very scary to you, that you may feel like I could die from this. And whatever's happening, it's outside your ability to control it. Okay, so a corrections officer talks to an inmate. There's a massive power differential already. You have 2 trauma survivors trying to come together and talk. And the action of one eye roll, one you know, slight that you might feel, whether you're a CO or you're an inmate, and it's on. So what we're saying is that inmate sees the CO a threat. I'm in fear for my life, and it's outside my locus of control, whatever this officer is going to do. That is classic trauma. So you bring those two people together, and then you wonder why there is tension, there is violence. It's part of their trauma, right? And if you're doing this without any knowledge, there's no way to stop that. And the good news is we can treat trauma. We can't make it go away, but we can definitely treat it. So what I want us to understand when we're looking at something like this particular slide, trauma does affect the brain's emotion networks. By creating what's known as a fixed neural network. It's a new pathway that your thoughts are processing through. And when that happens, it keeps your brain kind of stuck in the past. And it makes being able to cope with things a lot harder. And in fact, at times almost impossible unless you practice those, skills and strategies often ahead of time. Without doing that, you can't pull that in the middle of a trauma response. You can't, because the grown up in the head has exited. And this is why when we look at the brain's functions here, we understand that it is not their fault. It is what's happened that has shifted their worldview. And here's what I mean by that. So my worldview is that life is nasty at times. People will rip you off and they'll screw you over if they get the chance. Our lives are brutish and short, and people take advantage of you whenever they can. My wife sees the world as peace, love, Bobby Sherman. People are inherently good. And what makes the world go round is love. I love my wife for that perspective, but I can't get there. And I can't get there because I'm a trauma survivor and I've had a change in my worldview. This is really that simple. There's something else about this network that I'm just going to touch on. And it has to do with how a person who has an addiction has their reward system hijacked. It's very similar to what happens in these changes in the brain with trauma. And the only difference is, instead of shifting your worldview, it changes your reward pathway. And it basically hijacks that reward pathway. And this is one of the reasons, particularly with people who have an opioid use disorder, that they'll tell you, I don't have a choice to use. I have to use. And it's really hard to understand that if you've not been there. But part of the reason for that is because their reward system has been seriously hijacked, and it takes time to reset it back to normal. And the truth is, there are many people who have an opioid use disorder who are never going to get back to normal. And no matter what they do, their brain will not produce enough dopamine that they will feel normal. Exactly, Bethany. That's exactly right. It screws up your dopamine production and it ties right into that. And this is also why you cannot ask somebody that you start on medication assisted treatment, all right, here's your end date. This is when we want you to end. You can't do that because you don't know when that person may be ready to stop, and they may never be ready to stop. And the reason is not because they're getting high, it's because they're staying well. And if you've ever seen somebody in the middle of a dope sick, you can pretty quickly understand why they want to stay well, right? It's not rocket science. When people are as ill as folks who are in serious withdrawal will get. So understanding that there are actual physical changes is the key, right? Because this is not a moral failure. It's not, trauma isn't a moral failure. Addiction isn't a moral failure. It is, we can argue whether it's a brain disease or a behavioral health challenge. Who cares? Because we're going to treat it the same way. We're going to come at it trauma informed. We're going to come at it person centered. We want to come at it in a whole health perspective. Because if you just treat the addiction and you leave the mental health and the trauma to do its own thing, we're going to see that person back with with the a return to use, a new addiction, whatever it may be, because we haven't given them the tools or the knowledge to help start processing through why I do these things and how can I stop. Exactly, Richard. I always say this ain't no sprint. It is a marathon. And I've been in recovery 23 years. I'm still, I feel like a child at times in the amount of things that I need to learn. And I'm not the only one. I think, Emil and I have had conversations about this in the past. I'm not alone. He's not alone. And if anybody on this, on this event is, can relate to this, you're not alone either. Secondary trauma in the work that we do is very real. And when you work in a justice involved environment, there's really no way you can avoid secondary trauma. And when we talk about secondary trauma, all I want you to understand, you can do, there's all kinds of trauma trainings. I'm happy to come and do another one, but you can Google it and probably find just as good of a training online. The problem with secondary trauma is that it is sneaky, and you aren't quite aware that what's happening to you is you're hearing other traumatic stories, or you're dealing with somebody who has been attacked by an inmate, or you are responding to a critical incident in the jail, or you are a parole agent who is reading the crimes that somebody committed. All those things create secondary trauma in you. All of them. You're collecting them. They're just building up, gathering up in you. And if you're not aware of that, there will be some behavioral changes. And
I'd like to add something here, Stephen.
Yeah, please do. Please
Yeah,
do.
so it's especially difficult for people that are working as peers in justice involved settings, because we have all this trauma from our addiction and potentially prior to that, or complex PTSD as we're talking about. But for me, it was very difficult to deal with the corrections staff because I was used to being on the other side of the gate, you know what I mean? And yeah, so you're dealing with inmates or individuals who are incarcerated, and watching them go through the struggles that you went through and dealing with correction staff. So it can be very, very difficult, especially when you have a lot of empathy like me. It can wear you down, but self-care is critically important for peers. Thank you.
Yeah, Emo, that self-care piece is really, really important. And I think you nailed something that also is super important. Those of us who have this high level of empathy or compassion, particularly for folks that we see are going through some struggles that we've experienced, and that they really don't need to go through, and shouldn't have, if we would have been able to to intervene and support some way. But we're at higher risk for absorbing that secondary trauma. So if if you care about the folks you're working with, and you're not just there to get your paycheck and do your thing. That's some people do that. You're at higher risk for secondary trauma. Of course, the very people who are willing to help are also the ones that get the most negative impact from doing that help. There's some real terrible, I can't think of the word, but I don't like how that feels. And these things come just from hearing or learning about these distressing events and experiences, or caring for people who've got really bad physical or mental health injuries or addiction injuries, and then bearing witness to a survivor's physical or emotional distress. You talk to a family member, you talk to a crime victim, it's all secondary trauma, all of it. So we have the secondary trauma cooking along, and often it can create this piece of post stress, right? Post trauma, that causes us great challenges. We'll talk about this one in just a second. I apologize. Right before this session, my whole tray that held my keyboard and my mouse just fell off and is laying on the floor. Nicole, exactly. It is ironic. Thank you for that wonderful word choice, because that's exactly it. So PTSD happens after you're exposed to some terrifying event, something horrible. And remember what I said about trauma. It is an ordeal in which there's some sort of physical harm. Absolutely, Bethy. Absolutely. Cortisol is a nasty chemical. And that intense physical harm, remember that I said I could die. That's the thought. It's outside my ability to control that. And often I don't like the term flashback because I always connect it with LSD, but we do flash back to those incidents, and we struggle with 50 years later. I can still see my cousin chasing me around the house, the outside of the house, with a pair of scissors. And if he'd have got me, he'd have stabbed me. There's no question he'd have done that. Yeah, Roy, it does. It collects in that mental backpack. You're spot on. That kind of stuff, your family member chasing you around with a pair of scissors and swearing and screaming at you that he's going to kill you, that's got some pretty good trauma with it. And clearly, 23 years or 40 years or 50 years later, that I'm still remembering that like it was yesterday. Yeah, those persistent and frightening thoughts and memories of that ordeal. And Bethany, you're spot on. That happens all the time to me. And my wife often asks, well, why? What's going on? I don't know. I can't tell you why I just got triggered. It may have been somebody that didn't turn left fast enough and I got caught at the light. That triggers me. It could be that, my dog is barking at the leaves flying by in the yard, and I'm in the middle of trying to do this, and that can trigger me. So there's all kinds of these things, as Bethany points out, and as Emil says, they just happen. And it's why it's really important that we understand the strategies we need that help us overcome the response. It's not going to stop that tick of trauma, but we can grab hold of it. And we don't have to let it manifest, and I'll jump out of the car and drag that person out of the other car and probably get my buns kicked today because I'm old and I can't breathe because I smoked for most of my life. But I think you guys understand that's the kind of rage that happens to folks often who have PTSD. Before I go to complex PTSD, one thing I want to talk about here is how the worldview changes with PTSD. And with a single event PTSD, you still have a bit of a worldview change. But I'm going to use my wife as an example. She was raped pretty violently in her 20s. She's, in her 60s now. She'd probably kick me if she heard me say that. But she has serious PTSD around that incident. The thing is, My wife, when she gets triggered, usually it's like going to Kroger at 10 o'clock at night. She's not doing that because she's not walking through a dark parking lot. She won't walk my dogs at night, that kind of stuff. That's it, right? She doesn't have, she doesn't stay triggered. Her trauma button doesn't get stuck. Uh, and within an hour, all that stuff is gone and back to normal. That ain't how it is for folks who have complex PTSD. And the difference is that complex PTSD has, you can see, it incorporates all the symptoms of PTSD, but it's really around relationships. And it happens repetitive, and it often causes direct harm. And as I've been saying, these effects are cumulative, right? So as that brain is expecting this ongoing danger that you faced through childhood, it does affect the development of your sense of self and the world. And I told you before, my wife, peace, love, Bobby Sherman, me, be careful because people are out to kill you. You can't get more of a contrast in how those two worldviews are. And thank God that, my wife puts up with me because those perspectives that she brings are often the difference between me just going off or getting a hold of that trauma and the trauma response and dealing with it in a appropriate and effective way rather than some of the ways I've done in the past. When complex trauma is developing, it develops at earlier stages of development, and it happens because it's repeated, right? And it's often involving a relationship that's supposed to be a safe one. So when we have this complex post-traumatic stress disorder, it does have all the symptoms of PTSD, but it's different from that single incident, that rape trauma, because the impact on your nervous system is around attachment. And that gets deeply ingrained as a young person in a complex trauma situation. That relationship trauma, that's what we're talking about here. It's the relationship between you and the people who care for you and that are supposed to love you and keep you safe and all of those kinds of things. So your brain, as it's dealing with a parent, a uncle, a foster parent, whoever it is that's in your orbit that is supposed to be where you would find sanctuary, safety, support, that isn't happening. And it doesn't have to be physical. It can be verbal. It can just be neglect. It can be abandonment. It can be all of the above. So think about that for a second. Relationship trauma. The very people that we thought were going to be safe and there for us weren't. And so as we age, how hard is it going to be to develop a trusting and loving relationship with somebody? Because the very people that were supposed to do that for you didn't. And my worldview, because of that, I have complex PTSD. I have an ACE score of 9. I think I shared that earlier. I tell my wife all the time, and we've been together now 23 years, I trust you 97%. That's how much I can give you. I trust my dog 100%. I can only trust my wife 97%. And the reason is I have CPTSD and I'm going to protect myself because ain't nobody going to do what my family did to me ever again. And so I just shut that off, and I am always prepared to fling up a wall. And as I tell my wife, I will cut it off like a diseased limb and I'll cast it aside and I won't think about it again, because that's really been a big chunk of how I've coped in the past with things that, are traumatic for me. Your brain and your nervous system adapt to expecting ongoing danger, and it compromises how we see ourselves and how we see the world around us. And you can't even, I mean, no kidding, right? No kidding. If all you've dealt with for your young life has been bad stuff, you would change how you see the world. I certainly did, and there's a whole bunch of trauma survivors who, would say the same. It becomes deeply ingrained and instilled in how you think, how you feel, and how you function. You could develop something like constant hypervigilance. What that means is that you are walking around in a state of fight, flight, freeze, fawn readiness all day. And if you can think about the chemical dump that is happening, epinephrine, right, adrenaline, cortisol, norepinephrine. It's a chemical soup, all of them bad, all of them designed to shut everything off in your brain except emotion, so that you can, in an instant, make the decision to run, to freeze, to hide, whatever you need to do. So if that's happening to you, how do you move through your day then in an environment like a penitentiary? How do you do that? Because the moment you step foot in the penitentiary, you're going to become hypervigilant. It's a threat, it can be outside your locus of control, and you're in danger. You are going to have hypervigilance. And almost every CO that I've ever met, ever worked with, ever had to take orders from, I can see that today, that they absolutely have been operating in hypervigilance, and so have the inmates. So have our brothers and sisters who were locked up. I hate the term inmate, but everybody understands what that means. So you have this hyperarousal, this hypervigilance, because what you did is cope with the kind of abuse that you did or neglect as a kid. And because of that, complex PTSD is much deeper, and it takes longer to repair, and it takes longer to heal. It is absolutely a marathon and not a sprint. And there's something else about, how this happens to folks. Individuals who experience these higher levels of childhood trauma, they're at additional risk for health problems, heart disease, COPD, behaviors like smoking, drinking, drug use, and the impact of these after effects will cause a lot of us to isolate. And I'm definitely one of them, because I don't want to be around people because they're dangerous, right? And they impact my self-esteem, and they have great power to change how I feel about myself. I'm not putting myself in those positions because I don't want to hear it. I don't want to have to deal with it. And I'm pretty happy and calm in the life that I have right now. I'd like to keep it that way. And if I invite other people into my space, I run a risk. And I've run plenty of risks, and I've been burned enough times that I'm not taking those risks anymore. I think there's a number of us who, and particularly as we get older adults with substance use disorders really do tend to isolate more. You don't see them as much in groups. You don't, they go, but we do tend to isolate a little bit more. It keeps us safe, but it also leads to despair and suicidal ideation, because I certainly have had that at times. And then that increases the possibility of modeling those same behaviors to the folks around you, like your kids, right? This is why we have intergenerational cycles of trauma. That's why. And if you notice on the slide, the last bullet, effects are cumulative. That's what I'm saying. They don't go away. They're going to be with you. So when we are, dealing with somebody who is a trauma survivor, and we're trying to engage with them, We know, I just told you, avoidance due to expectation of not being truly seen. I won't go to crowds. I don't work with social workers. I don't want to because I know that the bias there can be overwhelming. I'm not talking about all social workers, and I apologize. I don't work with some social workers because they are stuck in a past mode of thinking. There are plenty, and I do some training for the Alabama Social Work School, and I'm really encouraged by the folks who are coming out. That they're also at high risk for secondary trauma because they are compassionate and they do care. Fear of placing trust in other people. No way would I do that. I barely trust my wife. More comfortable with transactional relationships. Yep, because when I had the good dope, I had a lot of friends. And I still don't understand why anybody would want to just hang out with me to hang out with me. I don't have anything to give you. I don't have anything to sell you. Why do you want to talk with me? That's so true. And so difficult to develop friendships with that often we don't. We don't. It's why we're isolated, and it's also why we get despairing, and it's depressing. I don't think I even have to tell you guys this. Difficulty following through with appointments and referrals and plans. Yeah, because they don't really matter, right? Those things don't matter. And then, of course, there's a loss of hope and our dignity and our self-respect. And every time that we have to deal with this, we go through that cycle, right? And if you add in drugs here, what ends up happening is we get the guilt and the shame from the stigma, and we end up feeling exactly like this: no hope, no dignity, no self-respect. And what we say is, I've had enough. I need a break. And we know how to get the break. We're really good at getting the break. And when we get that break and we have to return to, reality again, here it comes again: shame, guilt, loss of respect for yourself, all those things, until we need another break. And I spent 20 plus years in that vicious cycle. And I know there are people who have spent a lot longer time than me. We can re-traumatize people simply by a lack of privacy. So if you're in prison, I had to poop with 10 other guys. I had to shower with 200 other guys. I had no privacy, none. And when I actually was a watch office person, love that little poop emoji. When I got a job in the watch office, I actually got to go to a privileged dorm, and my cell had a door, and I could close that door enough that I could sit on the pot and not have anybody see me. And if you've never had to poop in front of somebody, you can't really understand how awesome it is not to have to do that again. So lack of privacy, unwanted touching, and I'm talking about not a hug, just walking past somebody and tapping them on the shoulder. That's enough. That's enough. That's unwanted. We didn't ask for that. And it definitely can traumatize us because a lot of people have been beaten. Embarrassing or distressing questions. We get asked them all the time at intake, at reception. We'll get them asked by COs, by other inmates, we get this a lot. And it's traumatic, because it brings us back to those moments and those things. Expert versus partnering. I know what's best for you, and this is what you need to do. Or tell me what happened to you, and how I might be able to support you right now. What is it that I can do for you? Only one right way. I got into recovery by using a 12-step program. It is the only way that you should move forward. No, multiple pathways, and how I decide to enter recovery is up to me. That personal unresolved trauma, so many of us have that, and it's hard to know. If you're not aware of what trauma is and what it does to you, you wouldn't even be aware that you are a trauma survivor. I remember when I had the sort of realization that I had been just exposed to tremendous trauma as a child, that it devastated. I mean, it knocked me off my feet, and I ran out of the room, and I processed that for a week at least, and then I realized trauma is trauma, and it doesn't matter how you get it, how bad it was. Once you have it, it stays with you for the rest of your life. Institutional inequities. Listen, we already know equity within a penitentiary, within the criminal justice system, is non-existent. And we've seen what happens to our Black and brown brothers and sisters, the disparities, the number of people that are incarcerated. We know that there is inequities here. Staff bias, we're going to talk a little bit about stigma and bias. I mentioned that earlier. I think, honestly, bias is probably the worst out of the two. You can step over stigma, but what you can't do is when you're sitting with that clinician, when you're sitting with the probation officer, you can't get away from bias. And we all have it, and it gets triggered in milliseconds unconsciously. So if you're a white person and a Black person comes into your office, within milliseconds unconsciously, most white people in America, when they see Black or brown, they instantly think of danger and violence. And there's a couple of other ones, but the danger and violence one really stuck out to me, because that's the knee-jerk bias that is happening to some white people when a Black or brown person just enters their space. And even if you're aware that you have this bias and you are doing everything you can to push that bias aside, compartmentalize it, set it aside, and do your job, it's still likely that the way you deliver care is going to be substandard compared to how you would have delivered it had you not had the bias. And that's not just coming from me. There's plenty of research behind that. If you're interested in looking at any of that, just Google Project Implicit and go take a couple of those little, they have little sort of case studies. You'll read through them, and then you can answer some questions. If you do that, I just encourage you, make sure that you leave some time for processing after you're done, because you're likely to find some things about yourself that you're not going to be real comfortable with. I don't care how advanced you might be in a recovery, or you're probably going to find some stuff that you didn't realize. And it's really important that we do, right? It's important that we do that, because we can't grow if we don't know. It's just not going to happen. So with all of this trauma happening, why do we do a trauma-informed approach? Well, because we know that trauma has a direct impact on all of us, not to mention all the indirect stuff that comes with it. It's important that we understand how to respond. That CO dealing with the person in the cage, if they understand a trauma-informed approach, they have great power to de-escalate what's happening. And the challenge is, if both of them have a trauma response, remember that as this trauma gets triggered, it's just like addiction. Once it gets triggered, you run on your brainstem, on your emotions, and the grown-up that lives in that prefrontal cortex, the forehead, leaves the room. So you have no grown-up in this conversation now. And this is why a CO, if they know how to respond, has great power to de-escalate and to return, all of us back to I wouldn't say sort of a normal experience, but at least one where we got our arms around, how our trauma response is going to come out. If we know the impact of trauma, we can improve the outcomes. Just what I just said. We understand how to respond. We can minimize the impact of that trauma, and we can improve whatever situation that we may be in right now with that. If we understand the trauma, we can manage the risk better. If you know that, Joe, this is his, this will be traumatic to Joe, then we don't do that to Joe, right? Or we find another way to come at it so that Joe isn't, impacted by a huge trauma trigger, and then doesn't hear anything we're saying anyway. And by God, we all, because we're human beings, we deserve a little respect and a little dignity and a little autonomy. I get it if you're locked up, it's, these things are challenging, but you're still a human being, and we take the worst people in our society and we still give them 3 hots and a cot, right? They're human beings. And so, we need to treat people like human beings. Yeah, some of the stuff that we do, is it's pretty bad, but it doesn't mean that we've given up our human being status as a result of that. So when we focus directly in on corrections trauma, I like to think of it as more corrections fatigue. And basically all that means, you've probably heard the term compassion fatigue. Often it's used in conjunction with burnout. They're completely different. And so with compassion fatigue, what you need to understand is that you may feel by the end of the day that you can't hear another story. You can't do any more with another person. You're done. You are out of your compassion tank, has run dry. You leave, you come back in the morning, and your compassion tank is empty. If you have burnout, when you return the next day, you're still going to hate your job, and you're going to hate that, you have to come to work, and that, why am I even bothering with this? Burnout is directly related to your job, HR, supervision, your pay, your vacations, the culture of your work. That piece is burnout. Compassion fatigue or corrections fatigue is just taking in so many traumatic things that you can't hear and deal and cope with them anymore. And you need a break. That break isn't like burnout. Burnout's break is, I need to find another job. Compassion fatigue or corrections fatigue is, I need space away from all this trauma for a bit. I need my work-life balance. And so I'm exiting out for today. That's it, right? And with corrections fatigue, it does better capture that traumatic exposure on a corrections professional. And when I say corrections professional, I'm talking about everybody from a CO to the person in the mailroom who's opening and inspecting your mail, to somebody who is in the administrative portion of the prison or jail. Everybody is impacted by secondary trauma in a corrections environment. It's unavoidable, and nobody who works in it is going to be completely immune to it. So knowing that, understanding that everybody in a corrections field is being exposed to secondary trauma out the wazoo helps us understand why sometimes our corrections officers, our parole and probation, aren't the most friendly, right? They're not the people that you want to invite for dinner. It's because you're dealing with another trauma survivor. So it matters because, as you can see, This is a 2013 study, and I apologize. I had all of the study citations up. They're now in the speaker notes. So you'll get a copy of this. It's up within 48 hours. So this will be there. If you want to take a look at those studies, have at it. But 36,000 COs, 34% staff and security roles, PTSD. 31% of those folks with depression. In 2016, 34% of the participants had PTSD, 36 with depression, and a quarter of them felt both of them. Rates of both, as well as the risk of suicide, this blows me away. We're higher among people working in high security units. I kind of get that. And among those who had worked in corrections for 10 years or more. What that tells us is that this stuff doesn't get better or easier with time. It gets worse. And unless you've got 20 plus years, there seems to be at some point in that, work tenure that this drops off. But it's way down the road. And I can't imagine that, you're not carrying a ton of secondary trauma if you spent 15 years in a penitentiary. And then when you look at the suicide rate among corrections officers, twice as high as police officers and the general public. And when you look at that risk against all other professions, it's 39% higher than all of them combined. Those guys and those women are in serious trouble. They are in serious trauma land. And we are feeling that. We're feeling it in the way that inmates or people who have been, incarcerated are released and re-entered, and what they bring from that experience. We see it in the numbers of substance use, domestic violence, suicide, mental health treatment. We see those numbers in corrections, and they are high. I mean, you can see them. They're scary high. And what's worse is that nobody talks about this for COs. We talk about it for the folks who have been incarcerated, and often we just point the finger at the COs that they're a big cause of a lot of this trauma. Well, that's true, but they are getting all of our trauma too. And you can't ask people who are constantly hypervigilant, constantly under this threat that's outside their locus of control, to just be trauma informed, just, say hi, be compassionate. It's not, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And one of the first things that we need to do is make corrections aware, right? Nobody is talking to them.
I have something to add here, Stephen. I mentioned this in the chat, but I've seen officers when I worked in jails go from a situation where they're trying to de-escalate or someone's spitting on them, who's maybe experiencing a mental health break or something like that, and then transition to the treatment pod where we have people who are, inmates that are trying to change their life or do recovery or et cetera. And the officer is unable to adjust from, this setting to this setting. So they go into the pod where people are trying to experience treatment and recovery, and they treat them as if they had just tried to spit on them. And it's very hard to make those transitions.
Absolutely. And I think what you just pointed out, Emil, is a large part of the challenge of bringing recovery pods into a jail or a penitentiary. And if we're doing that, one of the things that both Emil and I have learned is that those COs, they need some serious training, and they need the training and a designated role in that recovery pod. Because if they don't have that and they're moving from custody and control in their, kind of high security areas and then over to the recovery pod, you can already, the mentality of coming from high security is there. And they enter this, more lax, you have more freedom. That's a hard transition for somebody whose job is custody and control. And that's what COs do, right? Custody and control. And we're asking them really, in some ways, to become mental health providers. That's not something that they signed up to do. But it's, it's important that they understand the impact of trauma. They don't have to understand all the mental health stuff that comes along with it, but that impact of trauma, how it affects them, the work they do, and the people that they're doing that work with is super, super important. I talked about this already. Here's systemic, sorry guys, systemic workplace stress. That's burnout. Paperwork. I don't have enough time. My retirement benefits suck. Man, it's a pain in the rear to get reimbursed. I have that one. Family responsibilities, political pressure at work, the culture of work, and the hazardous duty that can come along with that. Burnout. I want out of this. I don't care. I'm done. I could give a crap. Traumatic workplace stress, that compassion fatigue, individual suffering firsthand, an extreme or life-threatening event, repeated exposure to secondary trauma, hypervigilance, this emotional and social isolation. That's definitely me. Escape and avoidant behaviors. I need a drink at the end of this shift. Intense feelings of anger or depression, domestic violence, child abuse, right? Those things happen. And a disruption to your trust, your worldview, and how you deal with your personal relationships. Those are huge impacts. Imagine what this does when that person leaves the organ or the facility and goes home, carrying their hypervigilance, carrying all that secondary trauma, and you need some time to chill and get beyond that. But what happens when you walk in from work? If you've got a family, they're going to want some time with you. And a lot of times we can't give it, just can't do it. So what does that look like to the family? It doesn't look good. And it translates to neglect and, and abandonment. Not to mention if there's any violence or, you can add those things in too. So we know that trauma does an awful lot to keep us coming back. It's the unresolved trauma that drives these behaviors, right? So when we look at the big challenges, we know mass incarceration is not just a public health crisis, it's an atrocity. And we know that it absolutely disproportionately affects Black and brown individuals. And we know that when you get locked up, the healthcare is basically non-existent. So if you've got other health conditions, you can expect them to get worse. The whole system is just rampant with stigma. It's severe and it intersects with other stigmas, biases, intergenerational trauma, you name it. It all kind of interacts with each other. There's a lot of intersectionality. There's disproportionate rates of suicide, of mental substance use and physical disorders, disabilities, and not to mention the really difficult challenges when we're asking people to re-enter. And all of those are made worse by stigma and bias. And, folks, if they don't know what's going on through a lack of resources or support, they're just destined to repeat what they've been doing all along. When we think about the direct barriers, stigma and bias, addiction, mental health challenges, homelessness, unemployment, that criminal record that gets your application round filed before anybody even looks at it, collateral consequences. If you don't know what those are, it's just regulatory and licensing issues for people who have felony convictions. And they do things like you never know about these while you're doing the plea deal or going to trial or whatever and getting ready to be convicted or plead to something. Collateral consequences are, here's an example. I've been to prison. I can't get a barber's license. I cut hair in prison. I can't get a barber's license. I couldn't work for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA. I can't get a job there. I do a ton of work for them, but I can't get a job there because I have a felony, right? Those are collateral consequences. And here's the thing. There are more than 40,000 of those things on the books right now in this country. There's a website you can go to. It's, if you just type in collateral consequences, you can look at your own state and see what those collateral consequences are in your state. Why that has value is because when you're working with people who are justice involved, you can help them understand what is going to work for them and what's going to be outside their reach. And it's really important that we are transparent and honest, because those of us who are justice involved didn't get much of that, from the arrest all the way through, not to mention what has happened in our personal lives. So these are serious things. They have great significance in stopping people from moving forward in their recovery, because you can't get a job, right? You can't do the things that you want to do. We got no social support because of the stigma and bias. There's really often a low education. I mean, I got a GED, right? And a lot of my brothers and sisters who were down, they don't even have that. Same thing with work histories. Mine was so bad, I wouldn't even list it. Poor health. This is a big one. Returning to a high crime neighborhood. What do they do when they release you? You go back to where they popped you at. What? That's the worst place that you could send me. Family violence when you come home. It's common. Unemployment, 5 times greater than the rest of the population. Peer pressure, which connects to the culture of addiction and incarceration. Excuse me. The only thing I'm going to say about stigma comes right out of Dr. Volkow's mouth. And what she says is, beyond just impeding the provision or the seeking of care, stigma may actually enhance or even reinstate drug use. And it plays a key part in the cycle that drives addicted people to continue using drugs. And I don't know, I've seen a number of folks in the chat who have very similar experiences here. I'll just say that when I read this, what I understood really quickly, sorry, I just got sidetracked by a really interesting comment. Apologies. I'll respond to this shortly. My own experience was this. You think I'm a dope fiend? I'll show you what a dope fiend looks like. I will run the wheels off this MFer. And that's what I did. It's what I did. Because nobody believed in me. So what's the point? Why would I care about being sober if I can't get a job? I can't find a house. Nobody likes me. Nobody cares about me. People are ignoring me. They step over me in the street. I don't care anymore. I just don't care. Give me that rig. It's that simple. And it happens a lot. And it's directly connected here. And this is of everything that I share today, personally, Emil, when he shares, I hope that you take everything away that he's got to say. But if you remember nothing else, remember this. There are subcultures in addiction, in incarceration, and in homelessness. Let me give you an example. If I said Newcastle Brown smacks you down, who knows what I just said? Kind of expected that from you, Emil. But do you know what I just said? What does that mean?
That brown
Newcastle
is good.
Brown.
That's some good dope.
There you go. We're talking about heroin. We do that to keep you out, right? We need language that helps us identify members of our tribe, allows us to speak in code, allows us the sanctuary of being with like people who won't judge us for the things that we do that everybody else judges us for. And those pieces, when we get burned in the mainstream community somehow, we get lied to, we get, somebody says, well, come in, we can help. And they take your kids away and they send you to jail and they suspend your driver's license. We don't find that real helpful. Even though we understand, we don't find that very helpful. And if you're asking us to return to that, why? We're not going to risk that again, right? We're not going to do that. Where are we going to get our support? From the subcultures that we have been living in, thriving in, know all the rules about, and get our needs met there. We can't get that in the mainstream community. Doesn't happen. So this isn't me talking about this. There's plenty of research that's around the impact of culture as a barrier to recovery. But the reason I raise it with everybody is because, particularly for opioid use disorder and for methamphetamine, we live in that enmeshed culture. So when he talks about 3 types of subcultural involvement, that enmeshed involvement is full immersion in the subculture, full immersion. So you have a really tight network. You have to, in order to get what you need every single day, 3, 4, 5 times a day. And if you don't have that, you'll be dope sick all the time. So we protect those little, networks. We'll protect them with our lives because they're that important to us while we're in the middle of that addiction. And just think about how difficult it's going to be to pull somebody out of that subculture and back into the mainstream community. It's next to impossible. Think about it. It's next to impossible because every time something happens in the mainstream community that is scary, that could be, have some negative impact, we'll run back to those subcultures because they'll accept us and they'll welcome us back. And, when you have been in prison and you have an addiction and you're released into homelessness, you have all 3 of these subcultures banging around in your head. When I left prison, it took me 6 months to be able to look a person in the eye again, to have a rational, normal relationship with a Black or brown person, because what happens to you in prison is strict segregation. You take that shit out with you. You don't leave that at the gate when you're gone. And it takes time to get beyond it. It's the same thing with homelessness. All of us know if you work with people who are experiencing homelessness, their grapevine is faster than my email. And they'll know stuff that you aren't even aware of long before you get to be aware of it. So those subcultures have great power. And the only way that we're going to pull people from those subcultures is to offer them a culture that is better. And the only culture right now is the culture of recovery. That's it. And, if we can't bring that to the table, then we have a real problem. And the reason we have a problem is because of those subcultures and because people are saying, come back to us. And it's real easy to return there when you've had a bad day. All it takes is a buddy to show up. You're talking about how crappy your day is. He shows you a syringe full of some goodie and off you go. It's that simple. And you've got your peer supporter right alongside of you, encouraging you on, filling your spoon for you. It's real hard to step away from that. So, all right, you've heard enough from me. Boy, have you ever heard enough from me. And I need to check time because I think we may be really close.
We got 5 minutes left, Stephen.
Jesus, I'm so sorry, you guys. Oh man, Emil, you should have jumped in and stopped me.
No,
All
it's
right.
okay. It's okay. I already spoke with Isabel Kai about potentially having a second round where we could discuss the peer involvement in the trauma-informed corrections. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide though, and kind of give you guys some of the basics here in the last couple of minutes that we have. So the importance of people with lived experience in trauma-informed care, whether it's corrections or in the community or wherever. So peers offer a unique opportunity to help people build rapport, gain trust, gain empowerment between people, that are in similar situations. One of the things that I really like about peer support is that research has started to show that people who receive peer support feel like they've been more successful in their own reentry efforts, and that's really the marker there. Reentry planning should begin at arrest. I don't know. I've mentioned this a few times in the corrections environment, and they look at me like I'm crazy. But some of the things that could look like is giving people Narcan when they're admitted into the jail and their property, so that they get released. They have that Narcan, so at least if they do decide to use that, potentially they could reverse that overdose, because people that are incarcerated are super high risk for overdose when they get released. It is vital
120
for,
times. Yeah.
yes, it's vital for employers and correction staff to provide guidance in determining best process for peer engagement within the facility. That's another challenge, is bringing peers into the facility and incorporating them and integrating them properly. But that's a discussion for another day. Yeah, but you have to have the leadership's buy-in. And if you don't, the lift will be too difficult, too challenging for any peer to accomplish on their own. Next slide, please. There we go. Facilitating successful reentry through peer support services. We're able to mentor people through this process of justice involvement, supervision, incarceration. And modeling a healthy, productive life is extremely important, because when I was incarcerated, I didn't have anyone that lived a healthy, productive life. And I mentioned this in the chat, if you want to escape these subcultures, you really have to focus on building new relationships. And I can't stress that enough. Relationships for me were, when I first got into recovery, it was a relationship with my probation officer, and building relationships with people in my community through things like community service and stuff like that. And here I am today, 5 years down the track, and I'm director of this nonprofit organization. So modeling that behavior is extremely important. We develop practical approaches and to setting and achieving goals. That's one of the primary things that we focus on here. Setting goals using recovery capital scale and helping people make small incremental progress towards those goals. We build trust to those who are receiving services and supports. And correction always almost is seen, correction staff is seen as an adversary rather than a source of support, and individuals are often ignore or don't participate as minimally as possible because they think that they're the man, you know what I mean? So and Stephen mentioned this earlier, but having a correction staff who's dedicated to potentially like a recovery pod is extremely important, because those officers have an opportunity to kind of be impromptu recovery coach. And there is some specific training for officers around how to be a recovery coach while they're in those types of settings. Let's see. I'm going to skip ahead to the Flagler slide. Stephen, it's 2:30 already.
Yeah, let's just do that.
Yep. I'll roll the video and then we can let you guys go here. So go ahead.
Only on 6 tonight, an exclusive look inside the Flagler County Jail and real raw conversations with inmates about the first ever all-in addiction treatment program inside the jail. The sheriff just gave a shocking number. He says 80% of all inmates coming into his jail are addicted to some sort of drug.
So just in the last couple of months, using federal grant money, he converted a section of the jail to help inmates with their addiction if they agreed to actually take the help. News 6's Eric Von Anken gets the first look at how the inmates say this is getting results together.
I committed a felony on St. Mary's Catholic Church.
Michelle Wilburn tells me she stole a donation bag from a Flagler County church. She was high at the time, she admits, yet again.
I have been in and out of jails and institutions all my life. What makes this time different, I'm gonna try not to cry.
Take your time.
Is that, I've lost a lot.
Good morning, guys.
This is what's different this time.
This is going to be ongoing, all right?
Inmates who are addicted to drugs or alcohol live together
Perfect opportunity to practice in here.
and recover together. They spend every day, all day,
I've used for 40 years.
with each other
All right, so we're going to back up.
and with their counselors. The first time addiction has ever been addressed inside the Flagler County Jail, the sheriff says.
If you're not treating the addiction or the mental health issue or the combination of both, then they're going to leave this jail and eventually they're going to come back.
Sheriff Staley estimates half of all inmates struggling with addiction do come back.
They're all, eating, breathing, sleeping, recovery.
So he asked the new jail chief to break the cycle and create 2 dedicated, isolated pods entirely for addicts, led by certified counselors.
I hear accountability.
And recovering addicts.
I was basically just like these guys, so.
One pod is for men,
I know too many people that are on drugs.
like Joey Samuels, back at the Flagler County Jail now for a 14th time. His 2 brothers are also locked up, and so is his dad here at the same jail.
For the first time out of 14 times, I'm tired of coming here and being in this program. The biggest thing for me is the support. I've never had so many people sitting in one room support my sobriety, recovery, or even my absence away from my own county.
And this is our female housing unit.
The other pod is entirely for women, like Michelle Wilburn.
You've been trying a bunch of times, but you believe now with what you're learning, it's going to be different.
I know beyond a shadow of a doubt it's going to be different because something has changed within me that I didn't recognize before.
The inmates will graduate from the program and be released here in May, but it doesn't just end there. One of the other things that the program does is check out and figure out where these inmates are going to go after they walk out of those doors, whether it's a treatment facility with supportive family members or, if nothing else, a sober living facility. At the Flagler County Jail, Eric Von Aken.
I want to add one thing real fast to that. One of the guys in that video is now the director of a different nonprofit organization here. One of the guys that was wearing an orange jumpsuit, he's now the director of a sober living. And, I love the trickle down effect of peer support and how it all, flushes out to see so many people in the long term being helped.
Emil, listen, thank you, brother. I know the work you did there because you and I kind of, we conspired for good trouble.
Yes, we did.
But what you did in that area alone has changed the lives of an awful lot of people, and it's shifted perspectives of the criminal justice system in the state of Florida. And I know that because I've done a bunch of trainings after Emil. Folks, I'm going to bring this to an end. What I want to say real quickly is the few slides that are left here, and I apologize, I got dived into other stuff. These few slides that are left are self-explanatory. It tells you about the barriers and challenges. It'll tell you where you can find peers. If you're looking for reentry support, it tells you some settings, and it shows you the barriers. Okay, so everything is here that you just hear me say. These barriers. I'm showing you this because I want to make sure that you have this access to all of the peer information, because I really wanted us to cover it. I think I will make it first next time. There's a little bit about harm reduction. There's a great video on drug courts right here. Just take a minute to watch it. It's only not even 2 minutes long. Here's the stats. And then this is Emil and this is me back in the day. We're in front of you today, and those are not the people you see anymore. So folks, thank you for your time. Thank you for everybody that showed up and just hung in there and stayed with us an extra 5 minutes. I hope to see some of you on Friday, and enjoy your afternoon. Thanks again for showing up today. and participating, because it all mattered. I can close us out.